Oh, no. Okay, we're gonna go ahead and get the Los Osos Basin Management Committee meeting underway. We'll call the meeting to order. Have a roll call. Dan?
Director Reinecke,
Present.
Director Gibson. Here. I guess director, well, we're jumping ahead. We'll skip.
That's right.
Chair Zimmer.
Here.
Okay.
We'll go to item 3, Pledge Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, I think before we go to board member comments, we're going to move item 9A to the front to first start with the Los Osos director change. And then we'll go to 9B with the appointment of the BMC officers, the remaining officers. So we'll transition to 9A right now.
Yep, and I don't think we need to do anything too formal. Just welcome Chuck Stesania as the LOCSD's new representative, or yes. Representative on the Base Management Committee, and the new alternate will be Matthew Forward.
Yes, thank you.
All right.
You paid the change of director's fees to the slush fund.
Yeah.
There's one slush fund I know of going right now, and it's up the hill. So.
Welcome aboard, Chuck.
Yeah, well,
Thank
thank
you. And thank you for agreeing to take over the leadership role. Because
Sure.
the CSD's kind of assumed that for a while.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Do we need a vote on that or anything, or just
That's
I do need to take public comment.
okay, we will transition to public comment.
If you'd like to make public comment on agenda 9A, please raise your hand or come up to the podium. There's no public comment online.
I don't think that's a committee role to approve. That's
No, that's
CSD's
CSD,
choice,
yeah.
so, okay.
but we could still take public comment.
Yeah, right.
It's agenda item.
Okay. We'll move to item 9B, the appointment of the remaining officers.
Yeah, before we do that, can I get a reminder? Let's please move all cell phones away from the microphones. We're getting a little bit of feedback. Thank you. Yes, so item 9B, appointment of the remaining officers. At the February BMC meeting, the BMC appointed Director Zimmer as the chair of the BMC, but deferred appointment of the remaining officer positions until this meeting to allow new representatives to be seated. So yeah, so what's remaining is just to appoint the vice chair, secretary, and treasurer positions for calendar year 2023.
Okay. Any director comments or
Well, I'd like to keep whatever position it was that I had, because that worked really well for me.
so the
As a
treasurer?
Treasurer, sure.
All right.
I'll agree with that too for S&T.
So by process of elimination,
Yeah.
come to the CSD as the vice chair.
Oh, okay, so we have 4 officers.
Right.
Okay, that makes sense. I'll do that.
And then that leaves, what's our last,
You're already in.
the chair, right?
Yeah.
Treasurer,
So
vice chair,
Treasurer, secretary,
secretary.
vice chair.
Are you okay with that, Beth? Okay. All right. We'll go to public comment at this time.
If you'd like to make a public comment and you're online, please raise your hand. And if you're in the boardroom, please come up to the podium. There's no public comment online.
Okay, there's no public comment in the room either. So do we,
I'll make that a motion.
okay,
Second,
all right.
I don't know that we need a roll call vote, so let's just vote. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Okay, motion passes 4-0.
Okay, we've taken care of 9A and B. We're gonna jump back to our agenda sequence here. And that will be board member comments. Do we have any board member comments? Item 4. No comments. Need to take public comment on that?
Nope.
Okay. Special
Sorry, yes,
presentation.
I do.
I'm sorry,
I'm
go
supposed
ahead.
to take public comment. I'm supposed to take public comment on every agenda item.
Okay, let's do that.
Sorry. So if you want to, there were no board comments, but if anybody would like to make a public comment, please raise your hand. No public comment online.
And no public comment. Okay, we'll move to item 5, a special presentation from the Regional Water Quality Control Board on our lower aquifer nitrate contamination investigation and an update. I'll turn it over to James.
Thanks. Chair
Okay.
Zimmer. That's me. Good to go.
Yeah, I think so. Thanks for coming, James. Yeah, the regional board requested an opportunity to present on the lower aquifer nitrate investigations that have been ongoing. As the BMC knows, we have seen the results of the previous investigations. I think James will cover that, and has in previous calendar year budgets funded or provided funding to support some of the ongoing investigations. But I'll turn it over to James.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks to the BMC for having me. My name is James Bishop. I'm an engineering geologist with the Central Coast Regional Water Quality Control Board. I'm presenting today on the nitrate increases that are observed in some supply wells in the western portion of the Los Osos groundwater basin. You know, the regional board is interested in understanding what the source of nitrate is to these wells, in part because if the nitrate that's causing these impacts is from ongoing sources, the regional board has a responsibility and an authority to mitigate these impacts. I am joined today by our WDR program manager, Jennifer Epp, who's my direct supervisor, and our wastewater programs manager, Harvey Packard. So just to kind of cut to the chase, some of the investigation that's been conducted to date has identified on-site wastewater treatment systems in Cabrillo Estates as a likely source of nitrate impacting these wells, along with manure from commercial horse boarding facilities. And the investigations have also identified potentially legacy nitrate from portions of Los Osos that are now sewered as causing or contributing to the problem. And so, you know, as I mentioned, if the source is from an ongoing land use practice, the regional board would like to try and mitigate that. And so I'm presenting today to kind of summarize what some of the technical work is that has been done, what that work reveals in terms of the source, and then to advocate to the BMC to collect some additional data that will help us better understand or more definitively identify the source of nitrate. I guess the second intent of this presentation is just to communicate to the public that there's a problem and that the regional board is working on it. One more thing is that we will be doing a second presentation on this same issue at the Los Osos Community Advisory Council meeting at the end of April. It'll probably be less technical in nature, but same general content. Next slide, please. So today I will be presenting a background of the problem, the land use and the hydrogeology. I'll be summarizing the historical modeling and recent technical investigations, I'll be identifying some data gaps and uncertainties and making some recommendations for additional data collection to help more definitively identify the nitrate source. Before I move on, I just want to acknowledge some of the data sources that I'll be presenting today. Much of the data I'll be presenting was data and analysis from Cleith Harris geologists, and much of that was funded by S&T Mutual Water Company and also by the BMC. So thank you for that work. Some of the historical data was funded by the CSD back in 2003 and was intended to help understand what the impact of the sewer project might have on nitrate concentrations in the basin. Next slide, please. So this slide basically lays out the problem. There are two water supply wells that are outlined by that red circle in the map on the left that are experiencing elevated and increasing nitrate concentrations. The concentrations are shown in the plot on the right with the nitrate concentration on the vertical axis. Golden State Water Company's well LA9 is shown by the gray circles, and S&T Mutual Water Company's well LA8 is shown by the blue diamonds. The maximum contaminant level or the legal limit at which water can be served to customers is shown by the red line across the top. And you can see that both of those wells have concentrations that are approaching the MCL or the maximum contaminant level and are increasing through time. And so we're trying to understand what is causing this elevated increase in concentrations. In order to understand what may be causing these nitrate increases, it's useful to take a look at the land use around these two wells and which land use practices may be contributing nitrogen to groundwater. This map shows various land use practices that can contribute nitrogen. Wells LA8 and 9 are shown by the yellow circles. Areas that are discharging wastewater via individual residential septic systems include Cabrillo Estates and Martin Tract. The Broderson leach field, shown by the purple shading, contributes treated effluent with low nitrate concentrations from the Los Osos Water Reclamation Facility. The commercial horse boarding facilities are shown in the green shading, kind of in the eastern portion of that orange box. And then some neighborhoods that historically discharged to residential septic systems, but now discharge to the sewer include Redfield Woods, Vista de Oro, and Sunset Terrace. Monarch Grove used to discharge to its own wastewater treatment facility at the golf course. And then the golf course, of course, or itself is a potential source of nitrate via fertilizers applied. And so, what this land use map shows that there are a lot of potential nitrogen sources that could be loading to groundwater. And I think the investigations that have been conducted to date have done a really good job at teasing out the most likely sources of nitrogen. But it's a confusing picture. The other thing worth noting from this map is that the groundwater flow direction in the upper aquifer is to the northwest, as shown by that orange arrow. And I will talk more about groundwater flow direction in a couple of slides, but we can move on from there. So this slide really is an overview of the hydrogeology in the area around the two impacted wells. The map on the left shows the location of the cross section on the right. So that red line in the map has a J and a J prime. Those correspond to the J and the J prime at the top of that cross section. That cross section basically shows the hydrogeology in and around at wells LA8 and LA9. And starting at the top of the cross section, you have the ground surface. Beneath that, you've got a large unsaturated zone. The upper aquifer begins where that blue dashed line is. That's where the saturated portion of the upper aquifer begins. Below that, in the gray shading, is the regional aquitard. And then below that are the lower aquifers. Wells LA8 and 9 are shown, and their screened interval, or where they draw in water, is shown by the kind of box that's around those. And both of those wells are screened in the lower aquifer. And so this cross-section is useful for understanding the path that a contaminant would have to take to arrive at wells LA8 and LA9. So for example, Cabrillo Estates is shown on the right side of that cross-section. Wastewater discharge from Cabrillo Estates would migrate through a couple hundred feet of unsaturated sediments, then travel as perched flow along the aquitard, enter the upper aquifer, then migrate through the aquitard to the lower aquifer, arriving at wells LA8 and LA9. The horse boarding facilities in this cross-section would be located roughly around where LA9 is. And then the other sources of nitrate that we identified in the land use map would be located to the left of well LA8 in that cross-section. And we can move on to the next slide. So this slide shows groundwater elevation contours for the lower or for the upper and lower aquifer. And these contours are useful for helping to understand the direction at which groundwater flows. And if you trace back that groundwater flow direction up gradient, you can understand where contaminants at a particular point might arrive from. So if you focus your attention to the elevation contour map on the left, which is for the upper aquifer from the fall of 2021, our impacted wells would be located kind of, yeah, thanks. Oops, can you go back a slide? The upper aquifer wells would be located kind of to the lower left of that elevation contour plot. And groundwater flows in a direction of decreasing groundwater elevations. So if you were to trace backwards from the impacted wells in opposite the flow direction, you would arrive basically at Cabrillo Estates is the location where water would be from at wells LA8 and LA9. Now that's in the upper aquifer, and those wells are screened in the lower aquifer. But it's useful to understand what the upper aquifer flow direction is, because contaminants have to migrate through the upper aquifer before arriving at the wells in lower aquifer. The other thing to note about the upper aquifer contours is that they're very consistent through time. If you look at the elevation contours as far back as 2003, they look very, very similar to the map that I'm showing you right here, at least in the vicinity of wells LA8 and LA9. And this suggests that the source of constituents that arrive at wells LA8 and 9 has been really consistent through time, at least in the upper aquifer. In the lower aquifer, on the right-hand side, the story is quite a bit different. Again, wells LA8 and 9 are shown by the cross in the left-hand corner there. And what you can tell from the contours is that they are spread much further apart, which means that the gradient is much flatter in this area. And it's more ambiguous as to where water comes from that arrives at these wells using just the elevation contours. A numerical model would be much more well suited to identifying where the water comes from at these wells. And then the other thing to note about the lower aquifer contours, if you look back through time, is they're much more variable than the upper aquifer. So there's a lot of temporal variability in flow direction and gradient. And again, a numerical model would be a much more reliable way to assess where water is coming from at these wells. So the next two slides come from historical studies that looked at how the wastewater treatment plant would impact nitrate concentrations in the basin. And this figure shows simulated concentrations in the upper aquifer after the wastewater treatment plant was implemented. The red colors indicate high nitrate concentrations, blue colors, low nitrate concentrations. And that red blob on the lower left-hand corner is in the vicinity of the impacted wells. And what the paper describes is that blob of high nitrate persists even after the wastewater treatment plant is implemented, because nitrate from Cabrillo Estates and the horse boarding facilities continues to be loaded and continues to contaminate the upper aquifer. And what's not shown by this figure, but is described in the paper, is actually that plume gets worse after the wastewater treatment plant is implemented, because loading at Broderson leach field creates a hydraulic mound that causes more westerly migration of that nitrate from the horse boarding facilities and Cabrillo Estates, and actually causes the problem to be in some ways worse at the location of the wells. Next slide, please. This figure is from that same paper, and it shows the simulated nitrate concentration at wells LA8 and LA9 screened in the lower aquifer with and without the sewer. So there's a lot going on in these plots, but I'd ask you to focus your attention on the blue lines on the left plot and the red lines on the right plot. Those are wells LA9 and LA8 respectively, nitrate concentration on the vertical axis. And what these simulations show are that under both scenarios, both without the sewer and with the sewer, concentrations are anticipated to go up in these two wells. And that's attributed to migration of wastewater from Cabrillo Estates and manure nitrogen from the horse boarding facilities. Again, it's anticipated to get worse with the sewer because of more westerly migration as a result of hydraulic loading at Broderson leach field. So I just present these because they provide some historical indication based on modeling that suggests that, we know what the source of nitrate in these two wells is. It's based on this modeling, it's Cabrillo Estates and the horse boarding facilities. Next slide, please. There have been some more recent technical investigations looking specifically at what is the source of nitrate in wells LA8 and LA9. In November 2019, there was a presentation on nitrate trends to the BMC. In September of 21, S&T and Cleith Harris perform an investigation into the source of nitrate in wells LA8 and 9. In September of 2022, S&T identified wastewater indicator compounds in well LA8 and refined the manure loading estimates. And in November of 22, Central Coast Water Board staff inspected the commercial horse boarding facilities and further refined those manure loading estimates. And then in March of 2023, wastewater indicator compounds were sampled in Golden State Water Company's well LA9. Those results aren't yet available. So first, I'm going to talk about the nitrate load or nitrogen loading estimates from the various sources. Again, we have our land use map on the left. And I'd focus your attention to the first two rows in the table on the right, which show the nitrogen loading estimates for Cabrillo Estates and the commercial horse boarding facilities. The first column is the estimated nitrogen load in pounds per year. And you can see that Cabrillo Estates loads an estimated load of 2,200 to 6,300 pounds per year, while the horse boarding facilities are less than that, quite a bit less than that on an annual basis. This next column is the estimated loading on a per acre basis. So pounds of nitrogen per acre per year. And here the story is different. The commercial horse boarding facilities load a substantially higher amount of nitrogen per acre compared to Cabrillo Estates. And that's because they're loading that nitrogen over a much smaller spatial footprint. The last three rows show the loading from areas that are now connected to the sewer. And I include this because what the loading estimates show is that these sources potentially loaded a lot of nitrogen historically, and that nitrogen exists in the upper aquifer and is slowly migrating to the lower aquifer. And that's important to understand because there is a potential that for legacy loading of nitrogen from these now sewered sources. So the other thing that was looked at was chemical fingerprints in the water sampled from these two wells to see if they could provide an indication of the source of nitrate at the wells. So this first plot I show is the isotopic composition of oxygen and nitrogen in the nitrate molecule. And these isotopic compositions have been correlated with nitrate from various sources. So for example, that blob on the top that says synthetic ammonium nitrate fertilizer, that's where that nitrate with that isotopic composition would plot up there. When that fertilizer was mineralized in the soil, it would plot in the blue box below that. Both of the samples collected at LA 8 and 9 are shown by that red dot. They plot on top of each other and they're essentially identical isotopically. And they plot in the overlapping boxes of natural soil, sewage, and manure. Based on the concentrations we see in those wells, we don't think the nitrate is from natural sources because the concentration is just too high to be natural. You know, the natural nitrate concentration in the lower aquifer is likely represented by the historical concentrations, which were 2 milligrams per liter or less. The concentrations we see now are likely from anthropogenic sources, and based on the isotopes are probably from sewage or manure. We can't tell based on the isotopes. However, the next line of evidence provides some more clarity on that. And those are the pharmaceutical and personal care products that were sampled in well LA8. And these are products that would end up in groundwater because they're either consumed by humans or they're used in humans' households basically, and they're discharged to a residential plumbing system, then to a septic tank, a leach field, and from that leach field could discharge into groundwater. And there were 57 compounds that were sampled and 5 were identified in well LA8, and those include 2 antibiotics, a household cleaning product, an artificial sweetener, and an aspirin compound. And so what these 2 lines of evidence, the isotopes and the personal care products and pharmaceuticals, tell you when you look at them holistically is that there is wastewater present. And that's confirmed by the pharmaceuticals and personal care products. However, we can't rule out the possibility that there is also manure present. So we know there's wastewater, there may also be manure. What the previous data doesn't tell us is what the source of the wastewater is. So is that from ongoing sources or is it from legacy sources? What this slide suggests is that we expect there to be ongoing pollution of the lower aquifer from legacy sources, from areas that are now connected to the sewer. This figure shows the modeled nitrate concentration on the vertical axis through time in the western and central portion of the lower aquifer. And this comes from the salt and nutrient management plan put together by San Luis Obispo County. The curved lines are different scenarios, and those scenarios aren't really relevant for this discussion. The take-home message is that all scenarios predict an increase in concentration through time, and that's attributed to migration of nitrate in the upper aquifer, moving to the lower aquifer from legacy sources. So yes, it is a possibility. The question is that what's occurring at LA8 and LA9? Next slide, please. We can look at data from other portions of the lower aquifer in the vicinity of LA8 and 9 to get a sense of whether we think legacy nitrate is what's causing the issue at LA8 and 9. So this data comes from 2 wells shown by the red circles in the map on the left in the lower aquifer, and the nitrate concentration in those wells is shown in the plot on the right. What you can see is that those concentrations are increasing through time in both of those lower aquifer wells. We don't know what the source of nitrate in those wells is, though it's reasonable to think that it could be from legacy nitrate from portions of the Los Osos that are now sewered. However, if you compare that to LA8 and 9, these concentrations are much lower and they're increasing more slowly. And that suggests that there's something different going on at LA8 and 9 than what we're seeing here. And it's possible that what's occurring at LA8 and 9 is that there is some legacy nitrate contributing, but that there's also ongoing sources of nitrate exacerbating the problem. So these last 3 slides, I'm basically going to summarize what we do know, what we don't know, and then make some recommendations for additional data collection that will help us more definitively identify the source. So what we do know is that upper aquifer groundwater flow direction suggests Cabrillo Estates and or the horse boarding facilities are a source. The lower aquifer groundwater flow directions based on elevation contours are a bit more ambiguous. Historical modeling indicates Cabrillo Estates and the horse boarding source are sources in the upper and lower aquifer. More recent modeling suggests that Cabrillo Estates and the horse boarding facilities are sources to the areas in the upper aquifer. Chemical fingerprinting identifies wastewater present in well LA8, and manure can't be ruled out based on the chemical data. What we don't know is nitrate present in high concentrations in the upper aquifer, down gradient from Cabrillo Estates and the horse boarding facilities? And this is important for connecting the dots between a discharge at Cabrillo Estates or the boarding facilities to impacts in the upper aquifer, then to impacts in the lower aquifer. And I'll actually add that I was made aware of some data from the upper aquifer in the vicinity of LA8 that does show high nitrate concentrations in the upper aquifer. So we actually do have some indication that that first bullet, that there are high concentrations. The second question is, what is the capture zone for wells LA8 and 9 in the lower aquifer? In other words, where are wells LA8 and 9 getting water from? Where does that water come from in the lower aquifer? Is it from below Cabrillo Estates, or is it from below portions of Los Osos that are sewered, or is it from all of those areas? And then lastly is wastewater from ongoing sources and or legacy sources. So in order to kind of fill these gaps, I recommend that we sample the upper aquifer for nitrate concentrations in the vicinity of wells LA8 and 9. And there's an irrigation well that has been identified that's screened in the upper aquifer in close vicinity to well LA8. That well could provide some really useful data for answering this question. And that'd be relatively low cost, low effort. The second recommendation is to identify the capture zones for wells LA8 and 9 in the lower aquifer. This could be done with the existing model. Again, because it's using the existing model, relatively low cost and low effort. And with that, I finish the presentation and I can open it up for questions and discussion.
Thank you, James. That was a great presentation. If there's no initial questions, maybe we'll go to public comment first and then bring it back for discussion.
If I could ask, if I could ask one, James, thanks. You know, the case here is made on modeling without to date any direct sampling of the upper aquifer. And for the scenario to work, you'd have to show in the saturated zone of the upper aquifer excessive nitrate. And in order to identify the source, you have to rule out other possibilities. So when you talk about identifying the capture zone in the lower aquifer for LA8 and 9, it would seem that if you're going to sample an upper aquifer well anywhere close to LA8 or LA9, you need to know what the capture zone for the upper aquifer part is as well. Isn't that correct?
That is correct. Cleith Harris has done some of that work and they included it in the 21 technical report. There's no figure, but they include a narrative description of the capture zone for the upper aquifer at wells LA.
Based on what?
Based on the numerical modeling.
Of gradient of what? I mean, that's that to me is, you know, in all of this, there's been a whole lot of work done without any sampling of the upper aquifer in a place where you could tie that to source, right? And I understand that sampling has to be in the saturated zone because the theory, you know, the water board did not include Cabrillo Estates in the prohibition zone based on some kind of understanding. I'm not privy to the technical, that the septic systems on lots that size were adequate in dealing with the nitrate problem, right? That's the base. Maybe Harvey has I hate to identify you as a source of historical information, Mr. Packard, but the record speaks for itself. But what I'm getting at is we've got modeling going on here. The question is, how far is the regional board from definitively identifying the source of this nitrate contamination? And what specific in situ measurement is necessary to establish that link? Because if we don't know exactly where the elevated nitrate is coming from, the whole point is to tie it to source. And I guess this is maybe more of a comment, but I haven't seen in this the control experiment that identifies that this elevated nitrate comes from this particular source.
Yeah, thanks for your comment. I think it's a good one. Just to answer your question about why Cabrillo wasn't included in the prohibition zone. So that is described in the 1983 staff report when the prohibition zone was adopted by the regional board. And it basically said that at the time it was thought that groundwater beneath Cabrillo Estates flowed to the west and not to the north. It flowed out of the main
West
part of the
and south.
basin.
And I'm not saying that it shouldn't be revisited. I'm just trying to get to where it is in the most direct way you can get the measurement that establishes source.
Yeah, I think sampling the irrigation well that is screened in the upper aquifer would provide a lot of information on, is the upper aquifer impacted in an area that's down gradient from Cabrillo Estates? I think that would be useful in tying that link together. We also discussed the possibility of doing something like a hydropunch sample where you
right.
And that's expensive. That's probably going to be, I would guess, upwards of $50,000 to do that kind of sampling. And so I guess I would like to start with these lower cost options initially and see if that gives us enough information to make a reasonable determination.
Look, it'll give us information. I guess the criterion to me is definitive information.
Mhm.
And so I would argue, if you start lower costs, could you run up a $50,000 tab without the definitive part of that? Whereas you spend $50,000 going to exactly the right place, is that perhaps not more even cost effective?
Yeah. I think the current cost being put forth by Cleith Harris is about $7,500, if I remember correctly. So it's quite a bit shy of what it's going to cost to do a hydropunch.
But if I could interrupt,
Sure.
if you haven't definitively identified capture zone, you got more technical work to do to identify capture zone. I'm trying to get at this as quickly as possible. I'm not
Sure.
weighing in on. It's perfectly possible a bunch of septic tanks up gradient that that has an intuitive appeal as a source. But for you all to come to your regulatory decisions, you have to have more than an intuitive appeal, right? And
Yeah.
so the question is, how can we get most directly to that? Because in managing the drinking water of this basin, we're on a program here. When we need to make some decisions and get some results in terms of basin management going, and if we gain how should we say, non-definitive data, I guess the only word that keeps coming to mind, and we continue this, we extend it in time, we extend the cost, who bears the cost, and why not design the definitive experiment to identify this?
Yeah, I don't think the hydropunch gets you the definitive result. I think, let's say you did the hydropunch, you sampled the upper aquifer, it comes back at a high concentration. It still doesn't tell you where that water came from. I think, you can get similar information sampling the irrigation well at a much lower cost.
Okay, I'll leave that.
Okay.
That's a technical issue for hydrogeologists, of which I'm not. So,
Yeah.
But again, you see where I'm going with the approach
Right.
here, is that I get opportunities, convenient opportunities, but that's not necessarily the most efficient path to get this.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I appreciate the comment.
Director Gibson, would you mind moving your cell phone again?
I'll turn it off. How's that?
I have a similar comment, but I'd like to do it after public comment. If we could take, unless you have a question, you have like a clarifying question or?
I mean, it's at your discretion. I mean, I think
Can you please turn on your microphone?
Sorry. Yeah, I'll make my comments now then, if that's okay.
I guess one thing I would point out, I guess a lot of my observation is a lot of times you have questions before public comment and then comments from the governing boards after public comment, but I don't know that there's.
My apologies.
That's kind of the way I was hoping to go, is that if you have a question that clarifies it, but I don't want to sway the
Okay,
public comment.
I have one question clarification and then I can hold my comments if that's okay. So one, thank you, James and the water board. You guys did an amazing job. I really appreciate everything you put together. One, I just want to point out, so some of your slides, I don't know if you could go back to them. They show the Monarch Grove Estates as a colored area. And I just think that it may be good for future presentations to make sure that's not colored, because it almost appears as though that could be a source, and that was always on sewer.
Yeah, I think the intent was to show, you're correct, it was always on sewer. They had a wastewater treatment plant that was located near the golf course. So maybe it's better to figure out how to represent the actual discharge location at the golf course rather than where the homes are located.
Okay, that was my only comment.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I just had a question. I had to look it up. It might be beneficial for others. Could you define isotope for us, James?
Oh man.
It brought me way back.
Yeah, so an isotope is a atom that has varying numbers of neutrons. So it has a different atomic mass based on the variation in the number of neutrons. So again, any atom is defined by the number of protons. Its atomic mass is the protons plus neutrons. An isotope, in its element can have varying isotopes where it has varying numbers of neutrons.
Great. Yeah, thanks. It's fascinating that that changes relative to the source of the nitrate. So
yeah.
Yeah, okay, we're going to move to public comment.
If you'd like to make a public comment and you're online, please raise your hand. And if you're in the boardroom, please come up to the podium. Would you like to start with online or in the boardroom first?
Let's go with online first, please.
Okay. All right, Larry, you just have to unmute yourself.
Thank you. I'm Larry Rayo. Thanks, James, for your presentation. I appreciate it. You made a statement that the groundwater has to go through the upper aquifer first before the lower aquifer. And I was just wondering if there's a possibility that, with Cabrillo Estates being up against the southern edge of the aquifer, if it can leak around, like, does the aquitard seal itself tight against the impermeable zone to the, on the vertical edge? Or is it possible that there could be leakage around that edge? And I guess the only other way would be maybe through some wellbore leakage. But I know water has a hard time going through a 50-foot aquitard without there being some fissures or other ways for it to get through, but it's not going to get through very fast through percolation. That's my only question.
Thanks, Larry. Yeah, a good question. And
well, and I guess our protocol typically is to receive public comment and then address questions at the end at the request of the board. So if we can just do that and then we can respond.
All right, Jeff, you just have to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, committee members. Good afternoon. My name is Jeff Edwards. And again, thanks to Mr. Bishop for a very cogent presentation. Actually, I have a number of questions, really not many comments, but the first one was also, as Mr. Rail framed, with the screening of those wells in the lower aquifer, it would appear the only source of leakage would be through the borehole or wellbore, So I'm wondering how this additional nitrogen can even reach these wells. Secondly, to confirm, more or less confirm the situation, we have two wells, an S&T well and a Golden State well at issue, 8 and 9 respectively. It's my understanding that the Golden State well, LA9, is going to be taken offline as their interest is to move pumping easterly, which is what the basin management plan speaks to. So they're in a process of complying or working towards basin management goals. So it really boils down to LA8 is my point. And my question there is, how high are the levels and what rate have they increased in those levels? Additionally, is there a way to do through DNA testing to determine or differentiate between the animal versus the human source? So is that a possibility? And then if the horses and Cabrillo estates were magically gone tomorrow, what would that do for for LA8 really? Because it appears, or at least the implications are that they can't use that well in the near term. And then lastly, who really pays for any of this, including the additional studies that are being discussed or any additional data collection? Thank you very much again. Thanks for the presentation, James.
All right, Deborah, you just have to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Thank you, James. The great presentation. My question is regarding the chemical footprint. We know what it is for LA8. Is there an opportunity to get a chemical footprint for LA9? And if not, are we just assuming that it matches what we're finding in the LA8 footprint? Thank you.
All right, Lynette, you just have to unmute yourself.
Thank you, James. That was a great presentation. I was wondering if the slides that you presented would be available anyplace online? Thanks.
There's no further public comment online.
Okay, thank you. We'll bring it back to the board. Do we have any public comment? Please come up to the podium.
Hi, I'm Lindy Owen from Los Osos. Mike, nitrates, kind of the old 25-year memory. The reason we put a sewer in was because of high nitrates. There were areas of town that had very low nitrates. There were areas that had really high nitrates. Cabrillo, I think, always tested high for nitrates, but whatever reason is a mystery still. It was taken off and removed. My question is, what's the difference since Cabrillo, I'll go back and say, Mr. Gibson was explaining that he didn't have enough rational information to let him know that there was really any nitrate problem in those wells, when that's the reason that you're looking at them, is the nitrates are extremely high there. In other places, they're not. So the question comes back to where they're coming from. I did not hear a clear proof that the fertilizers that have been put on sea pines for the last 30 some years have not contributed. Again, Jeff Edwards talked about a DNA study. I'm talking about the dyes that were used originally to put into certain septic tanks, and then you could sort of see what came in. If you put dyes down the toilets in Cabrillo Estate, you'll probably find the dye in the upper aquifer, and you'll probably assume that it goes to the lower aquifer. I don't want to see a whole lot more studies. I think the common sense approach is that Cabrillo Estates is going to be switching all of those septic tanks over to high-end mini sewers on site as they have to go along. It would probably be less expensive if they were sewered at this point. Our sewer plant was built to take a lot more than it is getting. So I think that's one way of eliminating a pretty obvious area that the nitrates are coming from. Horse farms, I think, needs to be addressed. I understand it's the urine that causes the high nitrates, and I don't know how you can change something like that, but I think I want to know about the golf course. And then obviously if the constituents are showing up, they're coming from bathrooms, and the circle is right there. S&T can hardly use their well right now. I mean, that's what I understand. So this isn't fair that that part of town has a pollution problem and regional board doesn't just step up and say, let's fix it. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Becky McFarland, Los Osos. Thank you, James, for the report. I always like learning new things about our aquifer. And I'm glad to hear this because when I first heard about the S&T well problems, I'm really concerned because I have friends and neighbors that live over there. So I'm glad to see some things happening. One suggestion is if you could point to things when you're doing the presentation so we can, because it's tiny, so we can see where it is. I know pretty well because I look at the maps and try to figure out what's going on. But yeah, it's a concern. It's a concern that a third of our houses in this town are not sewered. And I think that should happen. And I hope that would help take care of some of the nitrates. But again, thank you. Good report. And I'm always happy to learn more.
Thank you. There's no further public comment in the room. We'll bring it back to board discussion. Or James, do you want to clarify a couple of those questions, I think, that were raised there? You started in on that, but any of the ones that catch your attention, Phil?
Sure. Yeah. So I'll touch on Larry's questions kind of about, how much do we know about how far up the hill beneath Cabrillo Estates does the regional aquitard extend? My guess is that Spencer Harris would be better suited to answer that. I don't think we know a whole lot. What we would know about that, the spatial extent of that aquitard would come from wells that have been drilled, and the furthest uphill well is basically LA9 that I'm aware of. So the extent of the aquitard south of that, I think its presence is inferred, and it very may well be leaky. I will say that we know that the regional aquitard is leaky because you can't balance the water budget in the lower aquifer without assuming that there's leakage from the upper aquifer. So we know that water can migrate through that aquitard from the upper aquifer to the lower aquifer. We don't know exactly where that occurs. I think Jeff asked, how high is the concentration? Well, LA8 looks like it's about 6.5 milligrams per liter right now. I know S&T has estimated that their well is going to exceed the MCL or the human health standard in 10 to 30 years. Is that right, Beth? Jeff Edwards suggested the use of DNA to differentiate between the different sources. My understanding is that you need an organism in order to use the DNA fingerprinting. So you'd need viruses or bacteria present in the wells sampled in order to use that approach. There may be viruses and bacteria present in those wells, though it's unlikely that you would get viruses and bacteria migrating from manure and the septic system just because it's so far and it's through groundwater. The porous nature of groundwater tends to screen a lot of that stuff out. So it could be used. I don't it's expensive and I'm not sure it would be all that fruitful, but worth taking a look at. How long, if we were to turn off the source today, what would happen to S&T's well is one of the questions Jeff asked. It's likely that the concentrations in that well are going to increase for many decades after the source is stopped. And that was always anticipated with the wastewater project, that concentrations in the lower aquifer would increase for many decades into the future. The regional board has a responsibility to protect groundwater quality. And I think, the fact that concentrations will continue to increase doesn't mean that we can't fulfill our requirements. Who pays? I think that's a good question. Who pays for ongoing investigations? I'm hoping that there aren't a whole bunch more of these investigations. I think that, it's possible that this last round of data gathering that I'm advocating for here today could potentially give us enough reasonably identify the source. And of course, reasonably is subjective, I think, but it's all going to depend on what that data shows. I think Deborah Howe asked about sampling for the wastewater indicator compounds in well LA9. The 5 compounds that were identified in well LA8 were sampled in well LA9. We have not received the results of that, but those should be coming pretty soon. Lynette asked if the slides are going to be available. I'll punt that one to Jennifer and Harvey.
Yeah, we can make those slides available on the BMC webpage, and also maybe send out an email blast to the distribution group.
Okay, great. Then I'll work with Dan to send him the PowerPoint and make sure that gets uploaded. Let's see, Lindy was asking why Cabrillo Estates was not included in the original prohibition zone. As I was explaining to Mr. Gibson, it was thought that groundwater beneath Cabrillo Estates flowed west. We now understand it flows north into the Los Osos Basin. It was thought back in 1983 that it didn't flow into the basin, and so it wasn't included in the prohibition zone. With respect to fertilizers being a source, the isotopes of nitrate are really good at discerning fertilizer nitrate from other sources. So based on that isotopic analysis, it doesn't look like there's fertilizers are a substantial component of that wastewater. And then the use of dyes, it could be used potentially. It's probably takes a very long time for that dye to flow from Cabrillo Estates to the impacted wells, if in fact they do arrive there. And by long time, I'm talking, on the decadal scale. So, doing a dye tracer study would probably take a long time. And also there'd be so much dispersion in route that the constant dye concentrations may be hard to detect. So I think that touched on all the questions.
Yeah, thank you, James. Okay, director discussion. Beth, I think you had something.
Yes, thank you for those answers and clarification. So I'm gonna start this with saying I represent S&T here, and I will absolutely say the water board is doing everything that they need to do to address this. I don't view this as you guys avoiding the issue. I think you're approaching it from a scientific perspective, and I appreciate that. So I'm gonna go into a little more technical. I appreciate that you mentioned the water budget, because I kind of think of this problem from a mass balance perspective. So if you have 3,000 to 6,000 pounds of nitrogen going in from Cabrillo Estates every year, and Golden State's about to stop pumping a well that's removing maybe 8 pounds a day, where does that leave us in the long run? So I want us to not forget that part, because eventually when we're not pumping that, then nitrate is going to go somewhere, whether it's in the S&T well or another well somewhere else in the aquifer. We're not dealing with the problem. by avoiding it, but our kids will. So I want to encourage everyone to not lose sight here of what we are trying to do. And costs will be high regardless of which direction we go. But let's not avoid it for too long. So one thing I also want to mention, this kind of goes back to some of the comments. The gray shading, I mean, it looks very dense. And I think I've heard enough from, Cleve Harris and others that we might have a very non-homogeneous clay layer there. And there could be a lot more interaction between our upper and lower aquifers. So I really look forward to the magnetic imaging coming up. I think that can actually tell us with pretty good certainty the thickness of that layer. So I want to ensure that we are capturing that. Does that sound correct? And I also am curious if it can go deeper and tell us even farther down in the aquifer what we might be dealing with in terms of, compression and other things about that part, because in the long run, this is a scientific study and we need data that is going to be useful to complete that. And if we have access to it, let's not neglect that part. You guys have answered a lot. Going back to the S&T well, like I said, I mean, we can stop pumping our well. We can move our source to the east, but that doesn't change the fact that we're loading 3,000 to 6,000 pounds of nitrate into the ground every year. So I think that's about it for me right now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Beth. Any other discussion?
I took a fair amount in
Yeah,
before we went to
yeah.
private comment. So I would yield to you, Mr. Chairman, but I did have one concluding
Sure,
thought
go
that
ahead.
I'd like to offer. So appreciate your indulgence of me, James, in asking a lot of questions, and I really appreciate Director Reineke's. I love the technical basis that you're coming from. That's an important issue. What we're faced with as a BMC, though, is in addition, is a matter of making public policy. And since we have distinguished members of the regional board staff here, my goal, my objective in the questions / comments that I offered was that in managing this basin, this body, the BMC, needs to have a clear sense of the regulatory framework in which we're working. We're not a Sigma basin or adjudicated basin. So that sets some parameters. We have a basin management plan. We have a stipulated judgment. We have a series of programs. And so we operate within that. If the water quality in the wells that we note here is a matter of regulation by the regional board, it is important for us to know that sooner or later. And to that end, and again, I want to emphasize that I don't have a preconception of what the source of this nitrogen is, only that the suggestion has been made. A body of evidence is being compiled to point to a particular source or sources. What I would ask of the regional board is, as you make recommendations for further investigation, which is at someone else's expense, that's not something that you all do, is that you get the full suite of what you think you need to make your regulatory decision out on the table sooner rather than later, so that we can get to a solution here, whatever it has to be. It's about roles and responsibilities. There'd been suggestion that the county gets involved in putting a sewer in a Cabrillo Estates and so forth. That's a ways down the road. That's not a definitive action that the county is even contemplating at this point. But any future action depends on what regulatory decisions the regional board makes. And so getting the right studies as soon as possible and getting the regulatory decision as soon as possible is really important to the health of this basin. That's where I was headed with that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Sure, yeah. And great discussion. Answered a lot of my questions and were some of my comments, but in line with that, that's the part what Director Gibson was pointing at is, what is the role and responsibility of this body, and where are we crossing the line, and how do we stay within our framework? We understand, we have community water wells that are impacted. The health of the basin is part of our purview and very significant dealings. So I know, one of the potential scopes of work is to sample a private well. And so would that cost normally be borne on that private well owner as having a permitted well? Those kind of questions are where I don't understand that framework either, the legal framework either. But when you start talking about a $50,000 additional study, kind of concerned me a little bit that would come before this board, and I'd really like to understand those kind of dealings. We definitely want to be cooperative and helpful. I think a couple of things that caught my attention were we expected to see the increase in nitrate levels, and we're seeing that. In our well, you do see some elevated jumps here and there, and that was more from an operational and mechanical type situation that occurred for a short time, but it's not continuing to happen today. It is a concern if we do take the wells offline, how does that impact, the wells, and knowing S&T's situation, really trying to be as helpful as we can in, their unique situation too. So trying to tie all this together, and the last comment on that was really just the long-term framework that was really highlighted here in this presentation. This isn't gonna go away. It didn't happen quickly, and it's not going to go away quickly. So, what I'm hoping is that if there are additional requests, that we clearly understand those, and then we also keep in mind the end game of what we're expected to do from this body. If there's additional work that needs to be done, and we need to, the regional board needs to go out to other participants, and that those lines are understood, and we keep that boundary. I think this initial work, I guess my question right now would be, this initial work that's been discussed with Clete that hasn't been defined yet, but just some of those conversations, do you anticipate that'll get you to be able to make a decision on the action or the outcome, or do you anticipate that you're going to have follow-up work? And I think that's what Director Gibson was asking, and that was really my basis, is like, how are we going to keep, are we going to keep going down a trail, or is there an end in sight here? And if there is, let's go to that end, and if it's to stop pumping wells, or if it's to mitigate the land use that's contributing them, it's better to know that sooner than later.
Are you wanting me to respond, or?
I just, I guess the main question I have is the potential work that you've discussed with Clete, that is, that in your mind today, does that potentially satisfy your questions to a point, or provide you enough information to make a decision at that point?
It of course depends on what the results are, but yeah, I mean, this additional work is intended to answer the questions and allow us to make a decision.
Yeah.
Of course, ultimately it's up to our board to make that decision, right?
Right.
So I can make the decision at a staff level, and Jennifer and Harvey and I can. We have to take to the board for them to agree or decide. But you know, I don't want this to drag on to study after study after study. I think there is a possibility that this additional investigation could be it.
Or if I could reframe it, maybe the next set of studies should be designed with the highest probability that it would be it. So take, for instance, zone of capture, sample the one well that you've identified. Yeah, that makes all the sense in the world. But should there also be some kind of analysis of zone of capture for upper aquifer water in that well? To decide, I mean, because if that water could be coming from anywhere, then whatever the nitrate level in there is interesting, but not definitive.
Right.
So it's study design toward the goal of a final decision.
Agreed. Yeah.
Okay. I think for right now that what's on our agenda is to receive this report and continue the discussion with staff to review a proposal from Cleve.
Yeah, so, you know, at a staff level, you know, obviously we've been coordinating with the regional board on these data gaps, what, you know, the next steps will be. Well, this has been a great meeting. Thanks to James for coming and providing the presentation. So we'll continue to collaborate with the regional board on, you know, what are the next steps and how can we fund those moving forward. So, yeah. And yeah, James, didn't mean to put you on the spot with the isotope question, but you nailed it. So nice job.
Yeah. Thanks, Dan and the BMC for having
All right.
the regional board. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. It was a great presentation. Appreciate it. Okay. Moving on to item 6, the consent agenda. We have item 6A and item 6B, the 2023 budget update and invoice register and approval of the minutes. We'll open it to public comment.
If you'd like to make a public comment on the consent agenda and you're online, please raise your hand. And if you're in the boardroom, please come up to the podium. There's no public comment online.
There's no public comment in the boardroom.
Move approval of consent.
I'll second that.
Okay.
All in favor?
Aye.
All right, motion passes.
Okay, thank you. We'll move to item 7, public comment. Items not appearing on the agenda.
If you'd like to make a public comment and you're online, please raise your hand. And if you're in the boardroom, please come to the podium. Would you like me to start with online comments first?
Yes, please.
All right. Jeff, you just have to unmute yourself.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, committee members. My name is Jeff Edwards, and you may recall last month I suggested a special use bladder, an inflatable bladder dam on the south side of the bridge on Los Osos Valley Road. We know the lower aquifer daylights at the creek bottom, approximately a half mile south and up the creek. There's in the basin plan, and Cleve has shown it a couple hundred times, there's a cross section of our basin which clearly shows this daylighting of the lower aquifer. And last month I mentioned that we're in a period of climate change and we're going to see episodic periods of drought and rainfall, AR systems, and this rain, as we've seen for the last 2 months as an example, is emblematic of what future events are going to look like. And they're going to be separated in time, periods of, again, extended drought, and then, or less than normal rainfall at least, and then big dumps. So now I think it's time to really discuss that. And one of the committee members discounted it or dismissed it. There's no way to get permits. I disagree with that. I think it's quite permittable. And it's low tech. This facility would operate during significant rain events, allowing the creek flows to continue during operation. And this would be for periodically for maybe 30 days in the wet weather period. You're not using it at all when it's not raining. So right now we're devoting a lot of resources, the majority of our resources, especially wastewater resources coming from the sewer facility. Those are mostly going to Broderson, which is unproven. We're not sure if the mound is going to work. The creek bottom upstream is a known quantity. Upstream of Los Osos, on Los Osos Valley Road, there is a known quantity. So my ask is to direct staff to make this an initiative. Let's look at what the permitting regime could be and then go from there. I think you're going to find that it is permittable, especially in the context that I'm suggesting. Thank you very much.
All right, Howard, you just have to unmute yourself.
Oh, hi there. My name's Howard Weinstein. It's the first time I've ever attended one of these meetings, and I really appreciate everyone's time and all of the effort that's been made. I'm a landowner in the Forbidden Zone, and you know, I've had the land for a few years now. I've been trying to become educated as to the aquifer situation, the nitrate situation, the saltwater intrusion situation. And, you know, I bought this property from someone who waited years and years. He wanted to develop it and he got too old. And now I'm getting old. And I just thought, because pretty much hardly anyone predicted that we would have this historic, I dare say historic rainfall that we just have had this season and we're continuing to have. And, you know, in my own reading of it, you know, I know that drought conditions is one aspect of the water picture for the building moratorium in Los Osos. And I'm just wondering, because we had this massive rainfall, is that going to open up any other kinds of discussions regarding, you know, to resolve this situation? And I know there was one thing I'd heard about recently where Los Osos was going to be seeking additional water supplies, I think through Morro Bay. And I know everyone has a lot more water they did 3 or 4 months ago. So I wanted to know how is that discussion going, and are other kinds of ideas being talked about to, you know, make some good use of this water so that some of us can enjoy the land that we hope that we could develop one day. I know that's a very long-winded question.
There's no further public comment online.
Okay, we'll bring it back to the board.
Are you taking our comment now? Okay.
Yes.
Lindy Owen, I guess I almost answering Howard's questions. Buying property in Los Osos is risky because we don't know exactly what the future offers in the way of a secure water source. And we're all trying to make it work. I don't think most of us are totally anti-growth, but we're certainly not going to support our water getting squandered when it isn't secure. And I think Jeff is right. I think we've got some real opportunities to capture some of the water coming off of Los Osos Creek with with berming and something permanent. And I know we've been talking to the landowner out there a little bit about that, and possibly beavers. That could be a collecting wetland. It dumps so much silt into the bay. It's just, it's something that we ought to really consider. But the excessive rain did not put water into our lower aquifer. It did not supply us with more drinking supply. We don't know how much went in. Maybe you could ask Spencer if he has an estimate, because we don't know exactly where the water comes in, but the creeks hopefully did load some in, but it does not mean that we're out of a drought. This may have been just an extreme, strange weather pattern, because we're moving into zones on this planet that we've never experienced before. So those of us that are standing up to make sure that there is a sustainable supply before we have excessive growth or even a little bit of growth at this point, that's the reason. I want to know if Mr. Gibson has suggested that in the North County that they monitor all the private wells. And I wonder if he will support doing that in our basin, because we still don't know how much water is being taken out without knowing how much they take out. I've looked at some of the basin studies that are out there right now. Aerial flights to guess how much a crop uses have no way of telling you whether it's taking the top end of water use or the low end. So I really think it's time. I think the private well owners could be brought in. I think there's money that could be used to help balance out getting them on monitoring meters, just so that we know. If we're going to get scientific about this, which you just expressed your concern about, we need to know how much water they're taking out. And then they can also participate with us to not take too much, or at least tell us how much they're taking. Thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay.
Becky McFarland once again. And I agree about water capture. Governor Newsom has just talked about using captured water to recharge groundwater. I don't know how that could be done here. I've heard a couple of suggestions, but I'd like to know, is that something that the BMC has considered or has looked at any options for that? It would be interesting. But I wanted to comment on, after the last meeting, when there was the revelation that our county representative intends to petition the California Department of Water Resources to change the critically overdrafted basin status of our aquifer. I believe the community needs to be apprised of what steps have and are being taken to do that. I mean, what does that involve? Are we really ready to change that? Especially because we don't have everything in place to get the scientific data we need to know for sure. And then I also would like the same knowledge to be put out, information about changing the level 3 drought severity. And with the water we got, definitely, it doesn't look like drought, but what does that mean in our aquifer if it doesn't rise up? Anyway, we need, also, I'd like to see some straightforward answers as to why the rush to do this when the aquifer has not had sufficient time to rebound from decades of overdraft, and none of our metric goals have been met. The water level metric is still many feet below the minimum sustainable goal of 8 feet or above. And I realize there's pressure for more housing and other developments, and people have been waiting a long, long time to build. And the county needs tax revenue. We all know that. There's so many things that need to be done out here that money's needed, but we need to make sure the aquifer is in good shape and at least minimum sustainability before then. I'm really excited about the projects, the other well that's supposed to go in to give us more data, and the electromagnetic measuring of the aquifer. I'm really interested, and I like Beth's idea about, hey, measure as deep as you can. Let's find out as much as we can about our aquifer. It's interesting, but it's also vital to our community. Thank you.
Thank you, Becky. There's no further public comment.
Mr. Chairman, if I might, if Mr. Goldstein is still on, let me respond very briefly to his question. The question of future development of vacant lots really rests with the Coastal Commission right now, and the county's efforts to get the community plan for Los Osos approved by the Coastal Commission. And the key element pending there is the Coastal Commission's determination that the county has identified a sustainable source of water to support whatever level of development is proposed. And this 1 year of extraordinary rainfall does not alter that at all. This is a very long-term question that Coastal is looking at. If you would, Mr. Goldstein, like any further information, please don't hesitate to contact my office. We're pretty readily available. via the web, or this is Bruce Gibson, by the way, your county supervisor. Or you can give us a call at 805-781-4338. And any of the BMC members can get you pointed my way if you'd like to go that route too. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
I would like to add a comment. So I think the theme that we're seeing a lot after all this rain is we need more capture of the rainwater that we're getting when we get it. I mean, with climate change, if it happens the way they expect it to, our rainstorms are going to be more intense and potentially less frequent. So we need a mechanism in place to capture the water that we can when we get it. And I know for a fact that there's a lot of grant opportunities, and I actually think at the state level they're going to start shifting in that direction. So if we become eligible for grants, I would really like to see us pursue those projects as a community to ensure that we are capturing the rainwater that we do get.
Okay. Thank you. All right, we will move on to item 8, the executive director's report.
Thank you, Chair Zimmer. Yeah, the executive director's report, number of changes that we've made, both one in structure of the printed version of the executive director's report based on comments received from the board. We've attempted to streamline the executive director's report by removing sort of dated components. All that information continues to be available in the previous executive director's reports that hosted on the BMC website, should there be anything that you would want to see that you saw previously. But the goal is to focus the current format on items that we have updates for, or we would anticipate having updates on in the future. So, and then in the interest of time, typically I go through and kind of read all of the updates, but I think for today, given the length of the meeting and other constraints, I'll just wanted to hit a couple of highlights for the BMC. And then if there are any questions around other sections, obviously feel free to ask. One, with respect to the water recycling funding grant and the transient model, the RFP has been released for that to qualified hydrogeology and engineering consultants. And we're looking for proposals to be received on March 31st. So a couple of weeks from now. The next item is the AEM survey. No real specific updates on the survey itself, but just to make sure that everybody's aware of that. This again is the helicopter geophysics survey that DWR is performing and including Los Osos in. That survey is scheduled to happen in April. So that's coming up quick. So I intend to reach out to hopefully get the updated flight lines and confirm the timing on that, as I think this is something that I definitely want to go observe, and I assume others will as well. And to Director Reineke's comments, yeah, using this opportunity to further define the regional aquitard, I think it's a great idea. And so we can look at the flight lines from that perspective as well. And just two other updates. I just wanted to point out that in the executive director's report, it referenced in agenda item 9C, a proposal to further investigate the lower aquifer nitrate contamination. We actually pulled that from the agenda because we weren't ready. We were still working on what was the scope of that work. And so as we discussed with the regional board, we'll continue to coordinate with them, identify what is the work that needs to be done to find that definitive answer as to the source of the nitrates affecting the lower aquifer. And then we'll bring that forth to the BMC at a future meeting. And then just another thing we've added, it's a section on the Los Osos water recycling facility and the projects that are occurring out there. So there's a summary of those. And we added this because it's a critical component of the water resources here in Los Osos. We have a single source of water supply. We have a recycled water system that, hopefully with the projects that are described in here will help us offset lower aquifer pumping and improve water supply sustainability moving forward. And
right.
one more thing, sorry, just to Director Reineke's comments with respect to stormwater capture and recharge. I mean, what we have seen, it's become a statewide priority. The governor's recently issued orders to streamline that process and allow, the state to really take advantage of this excessive, or not excessive, but significant precipitation, and hopefully capture that water and put it into the ground.
Okay. And we did have, we've looked at the creek before, more from a wastewater discharge, but we really haven't looked at any of this capture opportunities. I mean, maybe that's something that we bring back at another time as an agenda item to look at that further. Thank you for the executive director's report. I just had one question regarding the RFP that's out on March 31st. Will you bring that to the staff meeting and have the staff review it before it comes? Will we see what's the process for that RFP, and how will it move to be a contract?
Yeah, and I'd probably used a bit of jargon there. So RFP stands for request for proposals. And so, yeah, the request for proposals, we've had reviewed by BMC party staff. The BMC, it was a while ago because of the length of time it took to get the grant agreement in place. It got reviewed by the CSD and its board, all before releasing to prospective consultants. So those consultants are in the process of preparing their proposals for submittal here at the end of the month. And then those proposals will be presented to BMC party staff. We've identified a selection committee that includes representatives from each of the BMC parties, and they'll review the proposals and then bring the proposals and their recommendation back to the BMC for their consideration for approval.
Okay, good. In the selection process, I mean, you have the cost aspect of it, but you also have basin knowledge and certain criteria like that that's weighted in there too.
Yeah, we will definitely be looking at it.
Okay.
What term we use is a qualifications-based selection process. Obviously, we've got a limited budget, so that's going to have to factor in. But yeah, we're really looking to get the most qualified and most efficient or innovative approach to deliver the scope of work that we've asked for.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions before we go to public comment? No? Okay, we'll go to public comment now.
If you'd like to make a public comment and you're online, please raise your hand. And if you're in the boardroom, please come up to the podium. All right, Jeff, you just have to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Jeff Edwards, and I wanted to go through about a half a dozen points in the ED report. The first item is the basin well database, and I understand that's been completed, and I've asked for it before, but I'm not understanding why the public can't receive a copy or can't be posted on the website for review. I would urge you to encourage staff to do that. Regarding the lower aquifer nitrate investigation, notwithstanding the water board presentation we heard this afternoon and consistent with prior comments I've made, I do not believe this is a basin management question or issue. Certainly not one where you should be spending money. We know that this is going to affect the S&T well solely, and as a result, it's their issue and it's a matter for them to deal with. So I discourage any further financial participation in that item. The staff is still hanging on to this organization and funding strategies, apparently. And I would ask your board to direct staff to not spend any more time on that. There are other initiatives that are much more fruitful and require attention now. So no more governance and funding. The in terms of a cleanup, I would omit the Los Osos vacation rental ordinance. I don't think that's much relevant to this committee, nor even the ADU ordinance, which is way down the road. So I would urge you to get those off. And then the recycled water, the water recycling facility project updates. And this is ARPA money to connect to schools. Well, I can tell you the Sunnyside school will not be connected. Their school district won't go for that. Monarch, their only turf area is overlying their groundwater or their stormwater retention. So that's not going to work at Monarch. Baywood has about 2 acres to irrigate. The middle school is the only one that has any meaningful contribution to basin management, and that's marginal. So this whole project update, this isn't critical. This won't move the needle, frankly. And then to the basin infrastructure projects, that's a document that needs to get cleaned up in my view, especially Program B, the reference to Golden State's blending facility, that's a non-starter. Then under Program C, we've got well 3 is still under adaptive management. However, we know based on 9C this afternoon, should be changed to active. And then
Hey, Jeff, we're going to have to wrap it up here.
I'll close right now with the idea that S&T and a Golden State Water Company interconnection is referenced, but I understand.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. Sorry, got to cut you off.
There's no further public comment online.
Okay. Lindsay, go ahead.
Lindy Owen again. I guess, did I understand what was just said is that those items that are on this part of the agenda are not worth talking about here in the committee, and that we're supposed to go read the reports? I'm just saying that I'm very interested in the recycle facility update. I think that's really important. It's been a major part of our basin, and I just didn't understand what you said, that we're going to minimize talking about those things so that we can shorten our meetings. Is that what I understood?
No, we just had the special presentation, so the meeting was going to go on longer than it was scheduled to. So on this one, I asked Dan just to highlight the important parts for this meeting right now, that changes that he had that he wanted to highlight. So it was only for this meeting right now because we had the special presentation.
Okay, because I think we all like the information, and I'm going to have to go search out this reclamation part. So thank you.
Okay.
Becky McFarland again. I just want to say I support working on S&T's well and Golden State's other well in that area. If the nitrates keep loading in that area, doesn't it spread out to other areas? I don't know how close the next wells are, so it seems like it would be foolish to ignore a part of the basin that has increasing nitrates. So I say go for it, and hopefully money can be found to do that. I did want to mention, in the reports, I went back and listened to the water board meeting from October, where board member Harlan really pressed, I think it was Dan and James Bishop, about getting more public information, education out to people, and regular updates that are easy for people to understand. I think that'd be really important, with executive reports and things like that, something that's user-friendly for everybody, that, high school student could get on there and look at that. Anyway, more information for the public, the more there is that's understandable, the better. And thank you.
Okay, we have no further public comment. We'll bring it back to the board. Any discussion?
How soon do we expect to see the compilation of the well database? Is that something fairly soon, next meeting maybe?
It's something we're working on at a staff level. You know, one of the challenges with well information and databases is sometimes they include confidential information that we can't share. And so we're working through strategies to try to make what can and is useful available, but what can't not available. And so it takes time to do that. I know that other agencies have struggled with similar things with well databases and information, and we'll come back with a proposed strategy. Yeah.
My comment is related to the lower aquifer nitrate contamination. I'm curious, if we struck it from this agenda, what are we looking toward then in the future? And does the Basin Management Committee have any goalposts in sight as far as what we are going to do, maybe in conjunction with what Water Board is going to do, just so we can keep the ball rolling?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the intent was really just to defer, not remove it as a BMC item. Just we need more time at a staff level to understand, hear the presentation today, hear the comments from the board and the public, and really hear from the regulators in this public forum, and then come to an agreement. Our typical approach is we like to collaborate at a staff level, get alignment on items, initiatives, and then bring them forth to the BMC for their formal approval. And so I think we just felt like we needed more time to do that. So my thought is that this item would come back just after we've had more time to collaborate. In terms of defined goalposts for the BMC and lower aquifer nitrate, I'm not aware that we've established any. And we have the upper aquifer nitrate metric is something that we track as part of the Basin metrics. But I would also say that, if you look back at the 2019 adaptive management study, Cleith geologists did an analysis of a number of different lower aquifer wells and their nitrate concentrations. And, that study really highlights to me that, while today's focus and discussion was focused on LA8 and 9, there are other lower aquifer wells. LA22, a Los Osos CSD lower aquifer well that is seeing increased nitrates at potentially even a faster rate. If you look at the curve that is used to define the change that's occurring there. One thing that kind of struck me seeing the presentation today, and you look back at those slides that show the predicted nitrate concentrations in the upper aquifer, and there was the high concentrations in the area around Cabrillo Estates. The other area showing higher concentrations was in proximity to LA22, which is adjacent to a portion of the basin that has unsewered residences. So all that being said, yeah, it's something at a staff level we're devoting significant time to, and I would anticipate us bringing something back to the BMC hopefully sooner rather than later.
Okay. I think if I can just mention it, I don't know what it would look like, but would it be possible or even something we could add into like the annual report? I mean, I understand that was historically not meant for lower aquifer nitrate contamination, but I think we have kind of quite a bit of evidence that indicates it's something worth tracking, and not just tracking, but commemorating in our annual report each year.
I'd concur with that. I mean, it's characterization of the basin, and any of these situations that pose issues to the sustainable access to safe drinking water, potentially become projects that this committee has to consider. And so keeping that in mind, I think is very useful. Whether or not we actually define a metric for lower aquifer, there's that difference. We like to simplify things and come up with one number that we can use. That is worth thinking about whether that's really helpful or not. We may just have to wrestle with the complexity of seeing where, what the nitrate concentrate, look at more like maps rather than single numbers. And that's just a matter of managing a complicated basin, complicated system.
Okay, I appreciate that. So I think currently our annual report only reflects the nitrate. Is it both upper and lower, or is it only mostly the upper as part of that metric?
Yeah, I'd have to review to see how much discussion may have been included on lower aquifer nitrate, but the metric is an upper aquifer metric. But I think kind of like the executive director's report, the annual report is also a great way to document other basin related items. I think a lot of times the adaptive management technical memorandums get included as an appendix. We could consider inclusion of the Cleatheris investigation, phase 1 investigations of lower aquifer nitrate as an appendix, and a narrative describing that and its findings as part of this year's annual report.
Okay. All right. We'll move to, we'll close the executive report, move to our 9C. We've already covered 9A and 9B, so we're going to move to 9C.
Thank you, Chair Zimmer, and I will try to move through this relatively quickly, but definitely want to take the time. This is, I think, some significant findings that are really going to inform kind of, the BMC's management and evaluation of the sustainability of the basin. So yeah, item 9C, this is a draft technical memorandum that includes updated sustainable yield estimates for the program C wells, incorporating the new adaptive method for calculating sustainable yield approved by the BMC in October 2021. So just brief overview. The basin plan included a number of programs, including Program C. Program C is a program to shift groundwater production from the lower aquifer from the western area, shown in orange on this figure, to the central area, shown in red. And it was proposed because by shifting production further away from the seawater intrusion front from the bay, the ocean, you can achieve increased production without inducing seawater intrusion. Or what that translates to within the basin plan is that you can increase the sustainable yield of the basin through shifting that production. And so this is a program that the BMC parties have been actively working on and have completed certain elements of it. So the first Program C well was completed by Golden State Water Company. It's located there, shown there over by Los Olivos Avenue. The second Program C well is what I'm characterizing as under construction. The well has been drilled, but the equipping of the well and the pipeline still needs to occur. So the CSD is leading that effort, and I think we're currently projecting that well to come online in 2024. And that'll be very beneficial. The third Program C well was deferred, and this deferral, without going into all the details, was basically deferred because previous sustainable yield estimates seem to indicate that the third Program C well wasn't necessary to achieve the basin yield metric targets. And so that's the way it's characterized in the annual report and the status of basin plan projects based on previous actions taken by the Basin Management Committee. However, with the new methodology, the BMC may want to reconsider that deferral. So I just wanted to briefly remind everybody of what about the sustainable yield, how we calculate it, and what it's used for. So as I mentioned, in 2021, the BMC updated the methodology for calculating the sustainable yield. And I should say that the sustainable yield is calculated using the transient groundwater model that the BMC's hydrogeologist has developed for the basin. And That model is used to calculate how much water can be extracted from the basin using the existing infrastructure without violating certain constraints. And we changed those constraints in 2021. And the changes that were made, I should say, we changed those constraints, and we also changed some of the assumptions or inputs to those model scenarios. Those changes were, number one, we didn't allow seawater intrusion to intrude any further than its current or 2021 extents. The previous methodology did allow for further seawater intrusion, but then stopped it at a certain point, and that was allowed under the old methodology. We've removed that. We also changed how we represent the Broderson Mound. The previous methodology assumed that the Broderson Mound was fully developed at 100% of its capacity. Current methodology takes into account the best estimates we have for the development of the current Broderson Mound, which are 50%, and factors that's an input to the model scenario. We also updated the long-term average precipitation. We lowered it from 17.5 to 17.3 by incorporating at the time, some more recent rainfall data that included a number of additional drought years. Thankfully, this year we're much higher than our long-term average, and so happy to see those results reflected in the groundwater modeling in the future. But that's the assumption that we use in the model. And then we updated some of the minimums and maximum production capacities of the BMC parties, or really the purveyors' wells. We wanted to make sure we don't want to calculate a sustainable yield that says that one of the purveyors is pumping this one well at its maximum rate all day long, when it turns out they only use that well, at very limited times for demand. So we wanted this calculation to be based on actual operations of the purveyor facilities and their wells. So with the new methodology, the sustainable yield was reduced from 2,760 to 2,380. And the BMC adopted that for 2022, and then readopted that new sustainable yield estimate for 2023. So just how we use the sustainable yield estimate is important. So what I hear based on input from Director Gibson, I tried to graph this. I really like graphs. So, so the graph on the right shows three things. It shows the current estimate of sustainable yield in light green, and that's the tallest bar. It shows the basin production target in dark green. That's the shortest bar, and that's 80% of the sustainable yield. That's a relationship established by the BMC with the adoption of the basin plan, and that's our target for production. And then in blue is a column representing the current estimated production in the basin. And so if we look at this graph, we see that the sustainable yield estimate is 2,380, the tall green bar. Current production is lower than that, significantly, almost 380 acre feet lower than the sustainable yield estimate as represented by the blue bar, which is great. That is where you want to be as a basin. You want to be pumping less than your sustainable yield estimate. There are many basins in California that cannot say that. But we're still pumping above our target, and that's what the dark green bar represents. As established by the BMC in the basin plan, we want to be at 80% of our sustainable yield, and this is done really for two primary reasons. One, there's quite a bit of uncertainty in that sustainable yield estimate. It's based off a transient model. We're only able to really characterize so many things. And there's just so much uncertainty in groundwater modeling and understanding of groundwater basins, because frankly, all of this happens underground and we can't see any of it. But also that 20% buffer is designed to also hopefully help push back the seawater intrusion front to potentially historical extents. And so both of those were factored into that buffer. So that's the sustainable yield estimate. That's the updated methodology, and we use it as part of the basin yield metric. And I try to stay away from the basin yield metric because I feel like it complicates the story, where we divide the sustainable yield by the production, and then we get a ratio, and then we want that ratio to be less than 80. So really, this is an attempt to really help simplify this. We want to be below the light green line, which we estimate we are, which is great, but we're still above the dark green bar. So there's still some work to do to get to our target. All that being said, and a lot of that actually doesn't impact this next statement, but the updated sustainable yield estimate methodology, which I started with, impacts the amount of additional water or increase in sustainable yield we estimate that the future program C wells will provide. And we needed to do a modeling analysis utilizing this updated methodology and constraints to help inform that. And so that's what Clearterrace geologists performed. So while there were originally estimates of how much additional sustainable yield these new wells would provide in the basin plan, that was based on the old methodology. So now we've redone those calculations with the new methodology. And here's a table of the results for the different combinations of program C wells. So I would say, like our current scenario, we are in well 1 only. The second column is the estimated production that well could provide. I want to say that is not the estimated sustainable yield that well provides. That's just how much water that well is estimated to produce. The column on the right shows the relative difference in the sustainable yield that these additional wells are estimated to provide. So with the new methodology, and the other caveat is the numbers on the right assume a fully developed Broderson mound at 100%. So that's why you're going to see that the 2510 is greater than the 2380, which is our current estimate at a 50% Broderson mound development. But the real takeaway here, and I probably should have added it as a third column, is the difference, or at least what we were asking them to evaluate was the difference. And so if you look at the second row, we see that the estimated sustainable yield with wells 1 and 2 is 2,540. That's 30 acre feet more than the estimate with just well number 1. And then the third takeaway with all 3 wells, the sustainable yield estimate goes up to 2,610. That represents 100 additional acre feet that greater than the well 1 only, our current situation. So I would characterize this that these estimated increases in sustainable yield are lower than under the previous methodology, but still represent a significant amount of water that could be available to the BMC through the further implementations and I should say a significant increase in the sustainable yield of the basin that could be achieved through the further implementations of the additional program C wells. The other thing that we're really seeing, I think, with these program C wells is it's almost equally, if not more important, that they be constructed to provide infrastructure reliability. A lot of the wells here in Los Osos are old. They're exceeding their remaining useful life. And so the purveyors are needing new wells, not just for new yield, but also just to replace infrastructure that may be failing. So really helps to improve our water supply resiliency here in the community. And I created one more slide just to try to hopefully help explain how this kind of could play out in the future with respect to the basin yield. So again, the graph on the left, so here instead of green columns, I now have green lines representing the same thing. So the upper line represents the sustainable yield estimate under these different scenarios. The light blue column on the left represents our current situation, where you can see we're under the sustainable yield of 20,380, but we're over our target of 1,904. As we move to the right, we start entering these estimates of these future scenarios. So the next column is well 1 only. What you can see is our estimated sustainable yield increases well, I should say that the only difference between the first two is the characterization of the Broderson Mound. So if we were just to not build any Program C wells now and just let the Broderson Mound fully develop, we would transition from the first column to the second column, and we would basically be right at our target, or right under it. The production, assuming production doesn't change, we're at 2,000 acre feet per year, and our target's 2,008 acre feet. So right at that target. If we then constructed the two wells and let the Broderson Mound fully develop, you can see we're now starting to get dipped below the target in a more significant amount. So the target would be 2,032 acre feet, and we'd be producing presumably around 2,000, assuming demand doesn't change. With the third well and a fully developed Broderson Mound, now we're starting to see even more separation between the basin production target and the at least current estimates of production. And I should just point out, for to put it in the nomenclature of the basin yield metric, anytime the production is below that darker green line, that we're achieving the target and we're below the basin yield metric of 80. So no action is required of the BMC based on this today. We just wanted to provide this information to the BMC. I would say one thing that the BMC might want to consider as we move forward with the preparation of the annual report or just other activities is reevaluating that deferral of the third Program C well based on these results and our updated sustainable yield estimate. It's something that we could do as part of adoption of the annual report, or that we probably should take it as a separate adaptive management item, so it's clear what the BMC would be considering and eventually approving. So sorry, a lot there, but happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Dan. Do we have any initial questions before we go to public comment?
Yeah, I just want a clarification. So as I look at these graphs, I notice we're adding wells and thereby increasing our sustainable yield. So I presume that's because of the location where we're drilling. Okay. And in the one slide, it showed that we had, is the one with your blocks. So it showed, that one. So it looks like we have the current estimate of our actual production, and our target is less. So we're meeting our target with these new wells because we are moving where we're pumping from, even though we're pumping more water.
In reality, we're pumping the same amount of water. We're moving the wells, which is increasing the sustainable yield and also increasing the target, which is 20%.
Okay. And this does not take into consideration new development?
No. So all these graphs and assumptions are based on a consistent level of water demand.
Okay, thank you.
So I think just to further clarify that, you would reduce pumping in wells on the westerly portion as you increase production of the new wells on the easterly portion.
Okay.
So you're not pumping more water, you're just shifting where you pump the water.
Right. But this is a volume, right? Acre feet per year. That we're above
Well,
our.
by doing that, you can potentially take more out of the basin because you don't, your seawater intrusion, you don't have as much hydraulic pull, so to speak, on the seawater intrusion. So theoretically, you could take more volume out of that.
Okay, yeah, I see that. I would just encourage if we're going to take this model in the positive sense, let's not forget too, we might be negatively impacting the basin on the western side, thereby decreasing sustainable yield at the same time.
Can I get a clarification on that? I'm sorry, Director, I'm not sure I followed that.
So I'm saying, yes, we're pumping in the western side of the aquifer, but if we're not considering the pumpable water, so if our well does reach the MCL and we can't pump it any longer and we have that whole basin, it's not sustainable water anymore. It's just a whole bunch of water we can't use.
Gotcha. Yeah. So kind of factoring in the water quality aspect.
Quality. Yeah,
I
that's what I was
get
going
it.
to say. This is a quantity. Yeah, this is a quantity analysis.
Right, yeah. I'm just encouraging that to be a part of the future consideration.
Okay, we'll open it up. Any other comment, questions right now?
I just think it's worth noting that the additional 2 wells, 2 and 3, essentially add about the same 100 cubic acre feet that we would be looking at with our pipeline over to Morro Bay and state water. I think that was the same target there. 200? Okay, so half of that. Okay.
Well, and one question I had is, it looks like perhaps the significant, if not a significant, if not the most significant effect is the development of the Broderson Mound. That makes that jump in going to the first assumption with well 1 only. And I guess we have transducers now installed. Do we have a sense of how that mound is developing since we last visited the subject?
Qualitative information, and we'll be bringing this forth as part of the annual report later. But Cleve Harris geologist has previewed to me that actually we may have seen a bit of a pause in the rate of increase on the Broderson Mound this year. So while we estimated it's at 50%, we were on a trajectory. The transducer data, at least preliminarily, is indicating that maybe that trajectory has dropped off a little bit. So we're still trying to understand what that means. Are there other factors or operational factors, or
do we have to update the model to account for the effect of the Broderson Mound?
Yeah. So yeah, I'll bring more information back. But yeah, no, the Broderson Mound is an important piece of this. I think you can see it here. If fully developed, the model estimates the Broderson Mound adds 130 acre feet of sustainable yield just by itself.
And what was the timing of that fully developed Broderson?
I think roughly we were anticipating another 5 years to achieve that fully developed mound.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh, okay, thank you for bringing that up, Supervisor Gibson. So maybe you could humor me and let me know where the transducers are. I've always wondered how we are measuring that Broderson Mound.
You're gonna put me on the spot. They are. To be honest, I can't specifically identify which wells, but my understanding is they are located in upper aquifer wells in and around the Broderson Mound.
Okay, I see. So we're just tracking the volume of water that is actually being contained. Is that what we're?
Yeah, the transducers, they basically, so I mean, all those wells are monitored as part of the biannual, monitoring program where they get a snapshot in time of the water level. The transducers allow us to have continuous data collection so that we can see the changes in water level and those wells on a daily or hour, I don't know what interval they're set at, but at a much more granular or detailed rate. And so it just helps us better understand really the amount of water in storage at those locations, which we can translate, or the water level at those locations, which translates to the amount of water in storage, which then also translates to how the water from the Broderson Mound is dispersing within the basin.
Thank you.
And I think the key there is, a year ago, we didn't have any transducers in. So as to how it was developing, it was really sort of, expected, modeled. But we know that the geology, for instance, can be more complicated than any simplified model could be. So now we're seeing what actually happens. And so it's one of these things like the well level metric and the chloride metric, we need to start seeing an extended time series on to be able to infer what actually is happening there. So it's an important step we've recently taken in understanding that.
Okay, we're going to open it up to public comment.
If you'd like to make a public comment and you're online, please raise your hand. And if you're in the boardroom, please come up to the podium. All right, Lynette, you just have to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Dan. That was a great presentation. Will these slides be available someplace for further use? Thanks.
There's no more public comment online.
Thank you. Lindy?
Lindy again. This is a interesting way to look at it, and I like graphs too. So thank you for those. I think my point is that a sustainable basin, in the way we're looking at it, only means that we stop pumping from the west side in order to stop the salt water from contaminating and destroying our basin area, storage area. It doesn't mean we have more water. We go to the east side and start pumping from there instead. All we're doing is coming in closer to whatever is central in our basin, if gravity has anything to do with it. So I have always wondered where we get some of this data. How do we know that Broderson has another 5 years? Do we know that the lower aquifer under Broderson has not already been salt intruded or close enough so that in 5 years we'll be trying to put water into a overwhelmed basin? It probably won't work. I still believe the sustainability is based on stopping from pumping. And if you get the agriculture to take the recycled water, whatever it takes to clean that up and get them to use that water, will save the eastern side of our basin. So I know that we all depend on whatever data we can get, but I kind of hate leaning towards the positive when I'd rather be far more cautious. We don't know how much future drought we're going to be looking at. If we have another 8-9 years of drought, we're going to be pumping more water out of the basin. So I want to be prepared for that. I don't want to overwhelm our basin. Thank you.
Becky McFarland, and I too like the graphs. Thank you, Dan. Nice colors. I did have I wanted a clarification. You had mentioned, you were talking about the transitional model as you were doing this, but don't we not have the transitional model yet? Is it a static model or whatever you call it? And then I'm wondering too about changing the pumping from lower to upper and moving it in. It's still taking out the same amount of water, but isn't that going to eventually push more seawater into the upper? Although I don't know if it was Beth, someone had mentioned that more seawater goes into the lower. Like, is there more pressure there? And that's why it pushes in more in the lower, and in the upper there's not as much pressure. So we wouldn't see that as much. So I just like to clarify that. And do we know the amount of water is needed to actually push any of the seawater back? Is that, are we hoping that'll happen when we reach the 8-foot level, the water level? And someone mentioned about the pipeline and how much water, but that's 200 acre feet, but just every now and then when there's enough extra water, like possibly a year like this one. Thank you.
Thank you, Becky. Okay, no further public comment. Any further discussion from the directors? I'd just like to make a comment. So Dan, you mentioned reliability as a factor here too. And I think that's one of the key, as we talked about the nitrates and the wells on the west side, this was part of the original basin plan, was to move these wells over to the easterly portion of the basin. And so how we work and implement this third well, I think it could benefit all the purveyors. This report's helpful. It shows that there is a benefit there. To have it as a deferred project in our basin plan is it's a status that it's in, but taking it out of deferment and putting it back as a project doesn't mean we have to do it today or there's not a timeline on there, but it does give us an opportunity to be in line with the basin. I know, we have many wells in the basin that are aging out and we're going to have to replace them. And so the fact that when we do replace them, we look for the optimal place in the basin to replace these wells is important. So right now, we receive this information, but would, as you suggested, like to move towards potentially bringing this back as a item to consider and take action on, to move it from deferment to an active project for us to talk about and consider.
Mr. Chairman, I agree. And I think that part of that should be establishing a timeline, which again, as I look at the needs of the basin and the potential future for Los Osos, is probably sooner than we think, given the amount of time that all of a sudden passes, for A to B. Getting that first well in was excruciating in its timeline. It seems to me that a couple of years ago, staff consulted with party staff on the whole review of all the projects that might possibly be of interest, and prioritized them, went through a prioritizing process. I know that's not a trivial exercise, but it might be something for you to, Dan, to discuss with member staff as to when that would be appropriate. At that point, I think we could entertain some of these questions of stormwater capture, which is, many directors indicate, gaining a lot of visibility within the state. And the question there is, we probably need to be extremely strategic about exactly where we propose such a project. We had stormwater capture actually proposed within the drainage system in the urbanized area to route those flows through the treatment plant to make them part of the recycled water supply. And so that might be another project which has come time to look at again. And so maybe later this year we could get into another review of what best thinking on those projects might be.
You want to respond?
Well, yeah, I'd like to respond to that. Yeah, so thanks, Director Zimmer, on the direction to bring this back as a more formal adaptive management item with respect to the third program Seawell. With respect to reprioritization of projects, I guess the way my thinking has been, we're embarking on developing a new modeling tool set that could really provide, I think, well, and actually the funding, the study part of that will allow us to look at not just recycled water alternatives, but also other water supply alternatives. So I think, and one of those is, a concept that was brought up when we did that last evaluation of different projects of, what about pumping upper aquifer water into the sewer system where it could be treated at the recycling facility, nitrates removed, and then it supplement or augment our recycled water supply. So yeah, we can look at all those different opportunities.
Thank you for that observation, given the number of hours I've yammered on about how we need a transient model.
So my only comment then, I actually am a proponent. I think we definitely need to increase the amount we're pumping on the east side, especially if that's going to mitigate our seawater intrusion. But of course, S&T is geographically separated from the east. So I just have to take this as an opportunity to say I would like S&T to be involved on Program C, regardless of which purveyor is directly drilling it. I think that's the appropriate way to go about this, especially since we haven't been a part of the first two.
Okay.
And given the interest from the neighbors in this part of Los Osos, the last time we talked about a new well, it could take some time. So I think that rather than just put this on an active project list, we think about it in terms of a time frame.
Yeah.
You're right about that.
Yeah.
Given the fact that the Cabrillo question's already back, if you'd have asked me many years ago at water board meetings when that would be back again, and if it would be back again, I would have said probably back again, but not this soon. I didn't expect that.
Yeah. Okay, sounds good. Okay, we did it. We reached the end of our agenda. The last item, adjournment. So.
All right.
We don't need to vote on that. No.
no.